We have a weekday readings today where the first reading is matched up with our gospel. Usually that doesn't happen. On the weekends, the first reading matches with the gospel, but just so happens to coincide today, and the readings being on stewardship and taking account. And stewardship is taking account of the gifts that God has given us. And I think, at least for me, when I think of stewardship, I think of the 3: time, talent, and treasure. But what's being stressed today, and especially Paul in our first reading to Ephesians in the 3rd chapter, is this stewardship of grace. He says, "You have heard of the stewardship of God's grace that was given to me for your benefit." And he goes on and saying of that mystery and things that happened to Paul now that he has become a minister, to share this gift with them, being a steward of God's grace. And really, being a steward of God's grace, I think, is summed up the summing up the parable of our gospel is that last verse. Much will be required of the person entrusted with much, and still more will be demanded of the person entrusted with more. Kind of just, there's the moral that just wraps everything up. And I've been, thinking more, for whatever reason, of maybe the number of appointments that I've had in the last few weeks, but the last few weeks just been thinking of like God's justice, that he's a just judge, and him just knowing him knowing the heart, him knowing one's background, him knowing and taking into account of everything. You're just thinking of like babies who are born. This was an example I can't remember I used the other day in some setting, of the babies that are born as like addicted to crack cocaine. I mean, that plays a role in so many aspects of this little baby's life moving forward. Like that God just takes into account. And this last line, much will be required of the person entrusted with much, and still more will be demanded of the person entrusted with more. Like what we've been given is just the grace with our baptism, the infusion of God's grace of faith, hope, and charity. Where that puts us with loving our neighbor compared to somebody who hasn't been. Me standing up before you and all the gifts that God has given me with, just formation of being, going to Olivet Nazarene University and going to a 4-year school that I just grew so much with my, in my relationship with Christ in college, and then being a focused missionary and my formation there and what I learned, and and even going back to just having a very firm foundation of knowing what is right and wrong from a very early age, and then 6 years of seminary formation. It's like not everyone sits with questions and actions of what right is wrong at the level that I do, or the level that you do. So God just knows all of that, and he's just. I mean, what percentage of people in the world are Catholic, who are practicing Catholics, who are at a daily mass on a Wednesday morning? It's a beautiful gift, and we are stewards of God's grace. Please, Lord, that I don't waste that. That I in any given moment, are presented with something that's right and wrong, or an opportunity to be charitable, being a steward of God's grace, am I wasting God's grace? Am I faithful, or a faithful and prudent steward to God's grace? much will be required of the person entrusted with much, and still more will be demanded, right? Those two words, required and demanded. And still more will be demanded of the person entrusted with more. That isn't to like, it's not for us to be walking around like shaken, right? But hopefully it's a movement. It's a movement to us, right? The saints always. It's a movement to poverty. It's a movement to our weakness. So it's a further dependency upon Him, which, thanks be to God, we have the Eucharist here. And oh, by the way, here will be in an effusion and an explosion of grace upon us when we receive Him in a mere moments.